You are standing in a marketplace. The air smells like bread and smoke. Coins clink in leather pouches. A merchant shouts prices in a language spoken across 3 continents. You feel safe here. You feel like this will last forever. But it won't. This is Rome in the year 400, and you, like everyone around you, have no idea that the world you know is about to end. Here's what it actually felt like to live through the fall of Rome. For most of your life, the empire has felt eternal. Roads connect cities thousands of miles apart. Aqueducts bring clean water into your home. Soldiers patrol borders so distant you've never seen them. You pay your taxes, you go to the baths, you watch the games. The empire has survived for over 400 years, and there is no reason to believe it won't survive 400 more. Historian Bryan Ward-Perkins, who spent decades studying the archaeological record of this period, found something striking. The collapse of Rome wasn't a single dramatic event, it was a slow erosion that most people experienced as a series of small, almost unnoticeable changes. A road that used to be repaired every year stops being repaired. A trade route that used to be reliable becomes dangerous. A coin that used to be worth something is suddenly worth less. You don't see an empire falling, you see your bread getting more expensive. By the early 400s, things that had felt permanent started to feel uncertain. The imperial government, once a stable and predictable institution, began making decisions that confused ordinary citizens. Taxes rose to pay for wars on multiple fronts. Soldiers stopped getting paid on time. Local governors started acting more like independent rulers than representatives of Rome. And then came the people from beyond the borders. For centuries, Rome had a complicated relationship with the various Germanic tribes living along its frontiers, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks. Sometimes Rome fought them, sometimes Rome hired them as soldiers, sometimes Rome simply let them settle within imperial territory in exchange for loyalty. This wasn't unusual, it had been happening for generations. But in 376, something different happened. A massive group of Goths, fleeing the invading Huns from the east, arrived at the Roman border begging for permission to cross into imperial territory. Roman officials agreed, but mismanaged the situation so badly, according to historian Peter Heather, that the starving refugees were exploited, overcharged for food, and treated with such cruelty that they eventually revolted. In 378, that revolt led to the Battle of Adrianople. The Roman army, one of the most feared military forces in history, was decisively defeated. The Emperor Valens was killed. Historians consider this one of the first true cracks in the empire's foundation, a proof that Rome was no longer invincible. If you had been a citizen living through this, you wouldn't have called it the beginning of the end. You would have called it a bad year, a military setback, a problem the empire would eventually solve the way it had solved problems before. That's the thing about living through historical collapse. You rarely recognize it while it's happening. By the early 5th century, the warning signs kept accumulating, but they accumulated slowly enough that people adapted instead of panicking. Wealthy families began fortifying their countryside villas. Cities reduced their populations as people moved to more defensible rural estates. Trade networks that once connected Britain to North Africa to the eastern Mediterranean began to fragment region by region. In 410, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, marched into the city of Rome itself and sacked it. This was the first time in nearly 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign enemy. The psychological impact was enormous. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described hearing the news as feeling like the entire world had been swallowed. But, and this is the part that surprises most people, life in Rome itself didn't end. The city wasn't destroyed. Buildings still stood. People still lived there. The sack lasted only 3 days, and afterward, daily life continued in a battered, diminished form. Bread was still baked, markets still opened, children still played in the streets. This is one of the strangest truths about the fall of Rome. There was no single morning when people woke up and the empire was simply gone. Instead, there were decades of declining infrastructure, shrinking trade, weakening currency, and growing uncertainty, punctuated by occasional shocking events like the sack of Rome that slowly transformed daily life into something unrecognizable from what it had been a century before. By the 400s and 450s, the western half of the Roman Empire was a shadow of what it once was. Regions like Britain had essentially been abandoned by Roman administration decades earlier, soldiers withdrawn, never to return. Archaeological evidence shows that within a single generation after Roman withdrawal, British towns that once had running water, public baths, and organized markets reverted to small agricultural settlements. The infrastructure didn't survive the absence of the system that maintained it. Ward-Perkins points to something often overlooked in popular history. The technological and economic regression after Rome's collapse was severe and measurable. Pottery production, a seemingly minor craft, virtually disappeared in some regions for centuries because the specialized trade networks that supported mass production collapsed. Cattle bones found in post-Roman archaeological layers are smaller than Roman-era cattle, suggesting a loss of the selective breeding knowledge that Roman agriculture had developed. Literacy rates dropped. Building techniques were lost. It would take centuries for some regions to rebuild what disappeared in a generation. This is what makes the fall of Rome so unsettling to study. It demonstrates that complex civilizations are not naturally permanent. They require constant maintenance, administrative, economic, and military. And when that maintenance fails, sophistication doesn't gracefully downgrade into simplicity. It can collapse, taking knowledge and infrastructure down with it. In 476, the Western Roman Empire officially ended when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. This is the date most history books point to as the official fall of Rome. But if you had been alive at the time, you likely wouldn't have noticed. The eastern half of the empire, centered in Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years. Many regions in the West had already been functioning without meaningful imperial authority for decades. The deposition of a teenage emperor in a city that was no longer the empire's political center barely registered as significant to most people living through it. The fall of Rome wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unraveling that took generations, experienced by ordinary people not as history, but as everyday inconvenience. Roads that didn't get fixed, taxes that kept rising, soldiers who stopped showing up, markets that grew quieter year after year. And this is perhaps the most important lesson historians draw from studying this period. Civilizational decline rarely announces itself. It doesn't come with sirens or headlines. It comes disguised as a slow accumulation of smaller problems that each individually seem manageable, while the underlying systems that hold everything together quietly erode beneath the surface. You are standing in a marketplace. The air smells like bread and smoke. Coins clink in leather pouches, though fewer of them than there used to be. A merchant shouts prices in a language that fewer travelers understand each year. You feel uneasy here. You don't know exactly why. You just know that something somewhere has already started to end.